Studios. Ladies and gentlemen, the Ace of Rays podcast returns in this new season of Man Cave Studios with a new logo and everything. How cool is that? So today's episode is the first of this season, not of the MLB season. I've kind of made 6 of these to this point. So let's talk. Let's talk about the Tampa Bay Rays. Now, the theme of today's episode is that I am doing it without notes. Usually, I come prepared. I have statistics. I have, like information on why the team is or isn't performing so well at a given moment, which is kind of based off of those statistics, how well certain players are trending, a highlight hitter, a primetime pitcher, all that. I don't think that's necessary today because over the last month or so since the last episode, I have discovered the reason why the Tampa Bay Rays are in the position that they're in. So let's talk about that position first. Tampa Bay Rays are not in a playoff spot right now. The articles on the MLB app will lead you to believe that the Rays are still in the wild card hunt. I find that very, very tough to believe, to be honest with you. Being, well, 7.5 games out entering today. Where are they now? Let's see. If the MLB website would load, that would be nice. Yeah, they're still 7.5 back. Um, I find it hard to believe that on September 14th you can be 7.5 back and still have a fighting chance in the wild card. They weren't 7.5 back last year, and they were written off by this point by everybody. So, yeah, I find that quite hard to believe. So, I think we should start considering the fact that 2 Sundays from now, when I'm recording this for the final time, that it's going to be more of a post mortem on the season. Um, Unless something really crazy happens and everybody above the Tampa Bay Rays starts losing, including the Astros, Rangers, Guardians, and Royals, and that the Rays go on some sort of like 14-game winning streak or something chaotic like that. Probably not going to happen. Never say never, but I wouldn't get my hopes up too much. So the Tampa Bay Rays, entering play today on this Monday, September 15th, the day that you're seeing this, they are 73 and 76. Like I said, 7.5 games back of a wild card spot. Forget the division; they didn't have a fighting chance with the Blue Jays being so good, and the Yankees and Red Sox right in line. I don't think a lot of people foresaw the Red Sox being as good as they were, especially after the Devers trade. I know I didn't, but they are in a playoff spot, at least as of right now. So you've got that. Um, the Rays are actually 14 games out from the division lead, so that's uh, not happening at this point. That probably qualifies for being officially eliminated from winning the division, even if there was a remote possibility. But despite all of that, and you take a look at the wild card picture, one thing stands out to me above everything else when I look at the standings. You've got, first of all, the top two wildcard teams have a higher run differential than any of the division leaders in the American League. The Texas Rangers, who are not in a playoff spot as of right now, they're 2 games out, have a run differential that is 74 points higher than the Houston Astros, who are in the playoffs. And then among all of the negatives that succeed the Texas Rangers on the AL wildcard list, you have the Tampa Bay Rays, the outlier, at plus 49. They score, or they have scored throughout the season, 49 runs more than their opponent. Their expected wins-loss, which would be 80 and 69, would qualify them for a playoff spot at this point. Well, it'd be pretty close anyway. They'd still be half a game out from the Astros, who are kind of in free for all right now. But for all that, they have lost 3 more games than they've won, despite scoring 49 more runs than their opponent throughout the season. That stands out to me. And throughout the past month and a half since the last episode, I think I have finally discovered the reason why the Tampa Bay Rays are in the position that they're in. They do not pass the eye test. They have a great starting lineup filled with guys that people around the league know. Brandon Lau, Yandy Diaz, Junior Caminero. People, I live in the Philadelphia area. When I tell people I'm a Rays fan, people come up to me and they say, wow, how about that Junior Caminero? Which, yeah, he's got 44 home runs. Like, he's a pretty good player. He's going to be a pretty good player for probably hopefully a long period of time. Um, for all of that, the Rays are, still, like I said, um, 3 games under 500. They just do not pass the eye test. Because here's the problem with the Rays, right? You've got all these great statistics. The bullpen is doing well in X amount of days. The starting rotation has been great on X amount of days, except for certain select pitchers, maybe. Um, the hitting has been there for most of the season, obviously. Otherwise, they wouldn't have that statistic of being 49, more runs scored than their opponent. Starting lineup, forgetting the names for a second. The leadoff hitter has an OPS of 825 and is batting 291 average on the season. Junior Caminero, well, shoot, I said no names, but you know who it is. 44 home runs on the season, second in the lineup. This is just yesterday's game. 259 average, 787 OPS, and a fair amount of home runs throughout the course of the season. A lot of clutch home runs. 28 home runs actually total, which is pretty good. It's a decent start to a lineup. The starting pitcher from yesterday's game came into the game with an ERA of 3.11. 6 innings pitched, gave up 2 runs. The not closer, the reliever who eventually got the loss did give up 2 runs in 1 inning pitched, but 4 total runs allowed by the pitching. It's not bad. Through 8 innings, that's not bad. In this league, look at some of the other scores yesterday. The Royals beat the Phillies 10-3. Now, in yesterday's game, you had almost everybody in the lineup, everybody in the starting lineup got a hit except for one. That was Carson Williams. Yandy Diaz, 1 for 4. Junior Caminero, 2 for 4. They both hit home runs. Everybody else in the lineup, in the starting lineup anyway, got a hit at some point, except, again, Carson Williams. And they lost. That should tell you everything you need to know about the Tampa Bay Rays. When push comes to shove, and they're in these tight games, these one-run games, where maybe at some points they have runners on first and second with nobody out, it seems as though that run very rarely scores when they desperately need it. In 6-0, 7-0 games, that run more than likely is going to score, which is probably the reason that their numbers with runners in scoring position have been so good throughout this season. But when it's a really tight game and they are in a position where, maybe they get a couple of leadoff hitters on, whether they're trailing 2-0, whether they're leading 3-2, whatever the case may be, in those situations, they seem to lack the hit that they need in order to prevail. Which is the reason I think that they are 3 games under 500. Because that just can't be the case. A team that I would compare the Tampa Bay Rays to are the Philadelphia Phillies. No, I'm serious. Take a look at the Phillies throughout this season. The Phillies are pretty inconsistent. I mean, they clinched the playoff spot on a day where they lost 10-3 to the Royals. They have games where they just fall flat, and yet they are still first in the NL East by a growing margin. It's not really close at this point. They've got a leadoff, group where the leadoff hitter has an average lower than our leadoff hitter. The second hitter in line has about as many home runs as our second hitter. Um, the third guy in the lineup, his average is actually five. Well, his average is .005 higher than our guy who was third in the lineup yesterday. And then fourth in the lineup is kind of where it dips a little bit. Um, they get a little bit of production from sort of the bottom part of their lineup, you know, but it's nothing more or less than what the Rays get from Chandler Simpson and Jake Mangum. Marsh hits 284 on average. Not much of a power hitter. It's kind of the same thing with Mangum and Simpson. Um, but yet here we are, and their pitching is really inconsistent too. I mean, their starter in today's loss gave up 6 runs, had an ERA of 6.44, and yet still the Philadelphia Phillies have 89 wins this season. I know the Phillies played the Rays earlier in the season. The Rays were not in a really good position at the time. They weren't playing as well as they probably should have. This was before they went on the run. Um, they just don't get the right hits at the right times. Like those were blowout games. You can't even like really analyze them and say, all right, well, what went wrong for the Rays? Well, it's kind of obvious in those, points. Pitching wasn't there, hitting wasn't there. That's it. Um, the Tampa Bay Rays do not get the hits when they need them at all, almost ever. The Philadelphia Phillies do. I, being from the Philadelphia area, I catch the end of a lot of Phillies games after the Rays games end, or I at least hear about how the Phillies games end. There are a fair amount of walk-offs that happen in Philly. And when it's not a walk-off, when it might be on the road or something, um, the Phillies, who much like the Rays, have blown leads this year like you wouldn't believe, including 5-run, 6-run leads at times. They still find a way to get wins in those games and other games too. Games that are tight late. In the bottom of the eighth, they get runs. In the top of the ninth, when they're up to bat, they get runs. You know, they've got a closer, which the Rays really don't, sure, but that's, not really that doesn't really have that big of an impact per se. I mean, sure, it probably costs the Rays maybe like 5 or 6 wins this season, but 5 or 6 wins isn't putting them in a wild card spot. I mean, again, their expected wins loss 80 and 69. That wouldn't even put them in a wild card spot. Still, and yet the run differential plus 49. They just don't get the hits when they need the hits. Part of that is the young team. Chandler Simpson and Jake Mangum are pretty new. The other part of that is just up and down the order this year. You get a Brandon Lowe strikeout with bases loaded and 2 out. You've seen this before, probably multiple times this season. Junior Caminero grounds into a double play when there are runners on first and second and nobody out, and the Rays are down a run. And so that cuts down 2 of the runners, and the next batter strikes out. That one, you can probably envision at least 3 or 4 times in your mind in the span of about 10 seconds how that is, when that has happened over the course of this year. That is why the Rays are in the position that they're in. 73 and 76 despite scoring 49 more runs than their opponent. So what needs to change this offseason? Because there was a fair amount that changed in the previous offseason, and it seemed to have worked for a time when the Rays were really winning a lot of games in late May and throughout most of June. And then it kind of stopped after that giant blowout loss to the Orioles, which was funny because it was one game in the stretch of a streak where they were the best team in the MLB, beating like some of the top teams in the MLB. They swept the Mets. Do you remember when they swept the Mets earlier this season? That happened. You were not dreaming that. That actually happened. They swept the Blue Jays earlier in the season. That wasn't even when they were necessarily hot either. Um, they swept the Detroit Tigers earlier in the season. or maybe they didn't sweep them, but they beat them 2 out of 3 games. A couple weeks ago, they swept the Mariners. Those are the 3 leaders in the American League. They've beat them, every one of them, in a series. And then again, they swept the Mets. The Mets went into that series on a, what was it, like some sort of a win streak, like a 6-game win streak or something, and the Rays snapped it and then wound up sweeping them. Like, and yet still, the Tampa Bay Rays are 73-76. The record against teams under 500, without even having to look it up, is just abysmal. They don't win the games that they should win. That also factors into it. But for the most part, it's really just the the runs that they score or the lack thereof. You know, when they come. Because in this 3-4 game yesterday, you couldn't have gotten a run when you really needed it in the 8th or ninth innings. Those are innings where you can almost envision, like, I can envision in that sort of situation, okay, if I'm watching the Phillies right now, 2 runs are getting scored. That's not the case with the Rays. And I've honestly come to expect it. It's almost like rinse and repeat, where it's just the same stuff over and over. You know, they just don't win the games that they should win, and they also don't get the hits when they should get them. The only time that they really win games are the ones where they come in and they immediately go up early by a lot, and then they stay up by a lot, um, or they go down by a significant amount and then cut into that lead and just chip away and then come back and then win the game by somewhat of a wide margin. That is the only time that you really see the Rays win, that you've really seen it throughout this season. Um, Not a lot of walk-offs at all. Not a lot of late inning heroics that I can really remember. The one game against Baltimore where they were down 8-0, which falls in line with what I just talked about. Sure. Um, but I mean, going back even to May, late May, and then throughout June when they're winning games, they the Houston series is a good example. In the first game of that series, they beat Houston 13-3. That's a blowout by all standards. In the second game of that series, they lost via walk-off 2-1. Not a lot of offense that night. In the third game of that series, they won 16-3. You don't need the big hit in the 8th or ninth inning when you're up by 10 runs, right? And those are the times where they're getting those hits and they're getting those runs. You don't really need that. You know, you would much rather have that hit in the 2-1 loss in that series because maybe then it's a sweep. Maybe instead of finishing that series 2 games, 2 games above 500, they actually played another game in that series on the 1st of June. They lost that one 1-0. So you get what I'm saying? You know, you get the amount of runs they gave up is constant throughout this whole stretch, this late May and throughout June stretch. For the most part, there are a couple of outliers, but you've got 3 runs given up, then 2, then 3, then 1, then 1, 4, 3, 3. The runs scored 13, 1, 16, 0, 5, 5, 4, 4. Okay, you take the 4s, I guess. The 5s, sure. But then you get into the times of the year where they're losing, starting in July, where they were the worst team in the MLB. Lose the first game of that month, 3-4. They win the next one, 6-5. Then they lose via walk-off 2 nights in a row at Minnesota. They win 7-5. So, okay, that's a tight one that they pulled out. They lose 1-5. All right, maybe a little out of reach. Maybe that's just one that Detroit, who they were playing at the time, was supposed to win. Then they lose 2-4. It's a lot closer. You could get a big hit in that game, and that could easily be tied. And then they win 7-3. Again, it's not a close game late. You don't need the clutch hit. 3-4 against Boston. 4-5 walk-off against Boston. That was a case of giving up a walk-off. I remember it because I was there. 0-1 and 1-4. 3 of those are 1-run games, and they didn't score more than 5 runs. And I've said it over and over, by the way. If the Rays score 5 runs in a game, they're going to win 80% of their games. And it wound up being a lot more throughout this season. For the most part, when they score 5 or more runs, they win a giant chunk of those games. Going through the rest of the month, they beat Baltimore. They After the All-Star break, they kicked their teeth in 11-1, which great. They win the next one 4-3. They lose the finale 3-5. Then they lose against Chicago 3-8. They win 4-3. They lose 9-11. So pit that on the bullpen and just pitching in general. The Cincinnati series, a lot of that was just blowouts, 2-7 and then 2-6. The last game in that series, 1-2, could use the key hit there. A couple days later, they lose 5-7 to the Yankees. They actually beat them 4-2 first. Then they lose 5-7, and then they lose via walk-off 5-4, and then they lose 4-7. So again, these are a lot of like close games that they can win. They're there for the taking, right? During the win streak, the most recent win streak, there was one of those games that was a 1-run game that was against Seattle. None of those were walk-offs. Most of them were on the road anyway. Well, at least a fair amount of them were on the road. Then when they started losing, let's see, one, two, three of them were 1-run games, and most of the rest were 2-run games. The ones that they lost anyway. The ones that they won were like 5-4, and they were also 1-run games. But if you could find the way to win those more often, like they're winning in their winning percentage this month post 7-game win streak, they've only won 2 games since then, which means they've lost more games by 1 run than they've won by any amount of runs total. That's a big swing. And that's been their story all year, is not winning those 1-run games. If they did, they'd be in a lot better of a position. But they just don't get the big hit when they need it. That is the issue. The other issue, obviously, is pitching. And I mentioned it there. You know, going back to the early part of the season, like they gave up more runs than you would have ever hoped coming into the season. Because remember, back in March, when the season was just beginning, the offense was the issue. And we all knew that the offense was the issue. And they made adjustments. They brought in a catcher with a better average, Danny Jansen, than the previous catching crew, who were completely unreliable all the time, always. They brought in a shortstop who was on the IL to start the season, and then they wound up getting production from their other shortstops as the season went on. And their outfield was atrocious with hitting last year. There might have been one guy who finished with an average of 200 or higher in their outfield. Well, what if I told you that their outfield, 2 of their outfielders would one of them would be leading or almost leading the American League in steals, and also have a really high batting average, and the other would still be batting 298, which is pretty respectable. Not to mention, the other guy, Chandler Simpson, batting 293. That's a far cry from last year's outfield, and then still they're actually worse than the team last year. A lot of that falls on the pitching. Hasn't been there. Some of them will have good games and then not be good in the next. Most of the time, it's really just like late in games, in clutch situations, the bullpen just hasn't come through. And it also feeds into that same thing that I was talking about with the hitters. Like they just do not get the pitching that they need when they need it the most desperately. When it's a 5-4 game and they're leading going into the 9th inning, they give up a leadoff walk. You've seen it over and over again this season. That's the type of stuff That is the reason right there why they lose some of these games. They've lost a significant amount of games on walk-offs this year. Going back to just July, they've lost, let's see, 4 games in July they lost via walk-off. 1 game in August. Going back to June, nothing because they were good in June. May they lost 1 via walk-off, and they lost 1 via walk-off in April. Feels like a lot more, so maybe a lot of that is just top of the ninth when they're at home. But that's just how it's been. They just haven't been able to lock it down as a team when they've really needed to. And there have been games, the Baltimore game where they came back down 8-0 was great and all, but they've lost as many games when having that sort of lead as they have, come back and won them. Not necessarily 8-0, but how many times have they gotten off to a really hot start and then lost that game? But again, the Phillies do that. The Phillies have done that throughout the season. The Phillies are 2 games behind the Milwaukee Brewers, who have the best record in the MLB. The Phillies are probably not going to play in the National League wild card round because they have won 28 more games than they've lost. The Rays have lost 3 more games than they've won. That's all you can really say. Like, that is this team. They just do not get what they need when they need it. They only get it when they don't need it. Like, oh, goody, the bullpen locked down an 11-1 game. Oh, that's great. Like, yeah, you hope that they would lock that down. I would hope that they give up 3 runs in that game and then give up nothing in the game that they're losing 2-1. But that's not the case. Or even the game that they're winning 4-3. That's not the case. When things are going well, they continue to go well. But the second that they face some adversity, it goes south quick. Now I'm not even talking about specific games, I'm just talking about the season. Things were going horribly to start the season. They were really bad. They found themselves as many as 4 games under 500 late in April. In May, they found themselves 5 games under 500. And then late in the month, they catch a little bit of a break, starting with the Houston. They walk it off against Houston at home, and obviously at home it was a walk-off. And that starts a winning streak of 6 games. From that point forward, they were the best team in the MLB. They lost 1 series between then and the series against Baltimore, which was mid-June. And that series that they lost was against Boston. They had won every other series, including sweeps of the Mets, which actually was after that Boston series, of Toronto. They beat Minnesota. They beat Houston. Well, they drew the series with Houston. They swept Texas, who had swept them previously. They beat Miami, okay, whatever. And then they play Baltimore, and they split that series, the first one. Then they play Detroit, and they win that series, and Detroit was really good at the time. They were coming in super hot. And then they end the month. They sweep Kansas City and only allow 1 run in that entire series. And then they give up 22 runs at Baltimore. And from that point forward, they were the worst team in MLB for over a month. And then they go on a 7-game winning streak, and now they've only won 2 out of their last 8. It's just the inconsistency. The inconsistency and not being able to get what you need when you need it. I don't know what you change about that except for the roster, really. I mean, is it the fault of the people who have been here for a while? Is it just the fact that they don't have that strong of a bottom of the order? They did. earlier in the season when things were going well, and then when they weren't going well, that same group struggled to hit. And some of them got traded, sure, but that is kind of a microcosm of the Rays season right there. You know, they were getting the hits when they needed them. They weren't getting them, or they were getting the hits when they didn't necessarily need them. They weren't getting hits when they did need them. And so, yeah, you look at like yesterday's lineup, for example, and it's like, okay, you get to 4, 5, and 6, and do you feel confident about any of those guys? Not really. I mean, yesterday was a little bit of a different story because Morel was fourth. That's not usually the case, and Chandler Simpson usually leads off. But even if you talk about, the big five of this team right now, as Simpson, Mangum, Lau, Caminero, and Diaz. After that, who's next? As of right now, who do you feel good about? If those guys all get on base and they score a couple of runs, but you need one more, who would you have at the plate? Who would you really rather have at the plate? My answer for that is actually pretty easy. I would want to have Josh Lowe because he has gotten a few key hits throughout the season. But at the same time, he strikes out a lot, and he's only batting .233. Do you see the issue there? When you get out of the good part of the lineup, your best hitter, your most reliable hitter, is batting .233. That's not the case with the teams that are making the playoffs. They can get clutch hits with the bottom of the lineup. That's not an issue. With the bases loaded and nobody out, teams that are in a playoff spot don't look at the next guy up and say, oh, yeah, this guy's striking out. We kind of do. And we should, because they often do. Strike out, ground out, double play, triple play. I don't think we've seen a triple play this season, but you almost expect it at some point. That's how it is. So yeah, no highlight hitter, no primetime pitcher. I've been gone for a while anyways. Um, when I come back in 2 weeks with the final, most likely final edition of the season for this series, we can dissect this a little more. Maybe there's something in the final 2 weeks to give us hope for next season. But I feel like I've kind of summarized it already pretty easily why the team is in the position that they're in right now. So, yeah, that's going to be it for this episode. Thank you guys very much for watching, and peace out, broskies.